Everyone in town laughed when Ethan Ward chose to live beneath the ground. They didn't laugh when his German Shepherd Ghost dug up the evidence that proved why 7 miners never came home. Like this story, hit subscribe and follow the next one that'll stay with you long after it ends. The road to Black Basin was the kind that made silence feel heavier than sound long cracked, half swallowed by weeds. The pickup rattled across the gravel. Ethan's grip on the wheel was steady, a soldier's habit that never left him. It always was. He slowed near the ridge where the remains of the old Black Basin mine cut across the earth like a healed scar. The company had poured concrete, planted wild grass, and called it reclaimed land. To the government, it was safe. To the locals, it was cursed. To Ethan, it was the only place left that didn't look at him like a ghost. He parked near the entrance of his half-buried home, a concrete hatch built into the slope, its steel door flush with the soil. It wasn't a bunker or a hideout. It was a necessity. After 6 years in prison for something he didn't do, silence had become the only space he could breathe in. Inside dim lamps, lit concrete walls, neatly arranged supplies, and a workbench. Everything precise, everything controlled. Outside, the world still whispered his name with contempt. The mole man, the murderer, the one who blew up his own crew. He'd learned to live with the whispers the way miners learn the dark. You stop fighting it. You just listen for the sound that doesn't belong. That afternoon, Ghost returned from his patrol tail, high jaw tight around something heavy. "What did you get this time?" Ethan asked, his voice gravelly, years of smoke and silence grinding it down. Ghost dropped a piece of blackened metal at his feet, tail sweeping the dust. It was rough, sharp-edged, faintly charred. Ethan squatted, turning it under the light. Numbers were stamped into the steel LMT 7421. His brows furrowed. That serial format didn't belong to any BBM supplier he remembered. The mine had used Delta Fires and Rockwell, nothing else. He cleaned it with solvent, the smell of oil filling the air. The numbers didn't fade. He sat back, heartbeat slow but deliberate. Something in his gut tightened. "Where'd you find this, boy?" Ghost's ears flicked toward the old slag heap at the far end of the lot, the place BBM's cleanup crews had dumped tailings before the shutdown. Ethan stared at it for a long time, then pocketed the fragment. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. That night, the wind howled through the ridge like breath through a flute. He sat by the vent shaft he'd built to keep fresh air circulating underground. Sometimes, the wind carried a faint gas smell enough to make any miner flinch. He'd tried not to think about the night of the explosion, but the smell, that sulfur-burned scent, dragged him back every time. The next afternoon he was outside welding reinforcement bars for a new support arch when a rock clattered off the steel door. Another followed. He straightened, mask lifted, squinting toward the ridge. A young man stood there, maybe 19, face red with anger. "My dad died because of you," he shouted. The boy hurled another stone, this one bouncing off the dirt near Ghost's paws. The shepherd stiffened, a low growl building. "Easy," Ethan murmured, stepping between them. "You don't want to do that." "You think hiding down there makes you less of a coward," the boy spat. His voice cracked on the last word, too young for that much hate. Then he turned to run, but his sneakers slipped on loose shale. Ethan reached out instinctively, catching his arm before he hit the ground. The boy wrenched free, embarrassed and furious. "Stay away from us," he snapped. "Everyone knows what you did." Ethan let him go. Ghost watched silently, tail low, head tilted. As the boy disappeared over the ridge, Ethan noticed something, a flash of orange plastic near the path. A broken flashlight, cheap and new. He followed the trail and found a flattened patch of grass, half-ringed with beer cans and candy wrappers. Teenagers had been hanging out here. He crouched, tracing the edge of the ground with his gloved hand. The soil was softer than it should be, freshly disturbed, and under it, faint but real, he felt the draft. Cold air rising from below. He lay flat, ear to the earth. A distant hum echoed upward, the deep hollow breathing of an old ventilation shaft. He hadn't known this one still existed. The company's reclamation map had marked every shaft as sealed. But this one was alive. Ghost stood beside him, ears erect, eyes bright with attention. "You smell it, don't you?" Ethan whispered. The dog's tail twitched once, cautious. He marked the spot with a rusted rebar, then backed away slowly. The ridge loomed dark against the sunset, the sky bleeding orange into rust. He could almost feel the mine beneath his feet, silent but restless, like something that had tried to sleep and failed. Back inside the bunker, Ethan placed the metal fragment beside a folded map. The serial number glinted under the lamplight, steady as a pulse. For the first time in 12 years, the air in his lungs felt heavier than the dirt above him. He knew that feeling, the quiet before a tunnel shifts, the second before the roof gives. Something under Black Basin was about to move again. And this time, he wasn't the one who'd run. The following morning brought a brittle cold that bit through denim and bone. Ethan woke early the way he always did. No alarm, just instinct. The light, filtering through the narrow shaft above his underground home, carried the color of iron, dull and lifeless. "Easy, boy," Ethan muttered, rubbing a calloused hand across the dog's neck. He'd barely slept. The number on that metal fragment had burned through his thoughts all night, and the draft from that vent shaft up the hill hadn't left his mind either. He stepped outside, breath fogging in the thin morning air. The ridge stretched before him, pale frost clinging to the grass, every sound magnified in the silence. From this height, Black Basin looked harmless, a valley of scrub brush and wind. But Ethan had spent too many years underground to trust what looked quiet. The earth always breathed in patterns. He just had to listen again. In the shed beside the hatch, his old field case sat waiting, coated in dust. Inside lay the BW gas alert monitor, its yellow casing scratched but functional. He changed the batteries, ran a calibration check, and clipped the sensor to his jacket. Ghost followed him to the ridge as he started logging readings. Every reading was logged with military precision. It was the same precision he'd used back in the Corps, back when mistakes cost lives, not just sleep. For 7 days, Ethan tracked the data. Every morning, he'd climb the slope, take readings along the old ventilation shafts, and compare them with the barometric charts on his laptop. By day 3, a pattern emerged. Dropping pressure pushed methane up, rising pressure pushed it back down. The ground was breathing, exhaling gas through sealed soil. It wasn't imagination, it was rhythm. The kind a mine shouldn't have once it's been reclaimed. One afternoon, as clouds gathered over the ridge, Ghost froze mid-step. The shepherd's nose brushed the dirt tail stiff, then he began digging with urgency, paws throwing clumps of earth aside. "What is it?" Ethan crouched beside him. Beneath the loose soil was a thin fracture running like a scar along the slope. He held the gas monitor near the crack. The numbers spiked instantly. He reached for the smoke tube from his belt, snapped the capsule, and blew a faint gray stream toward the opening. The smoke curled downward instead of drifting away, sucked into the ground as if the mine itself were inhaling. Ethan felt a slow electric tension move through his chest. This was no random leak, it was a pressure vent hidden under soil that shouldn't move. "That's not supposed to happen," he murmured. Ghost's ears flattened uneasy. The wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic tang like rust, and something sharper, burned oil maybe. Ethan stood watching the smoke vanish into the crack until the last wisp was gone. He snapped the notebook shut, jaw set with determination. By evening, the frost had melted into mist. He sat by his workbench, the gas monitor blinking beside his coffee mug. His data lined up neatly in rows, but every number spelled the same thing: the mine was still alive. When the knock came, it startled him. He wasn't used to visitors. No one came this far unless they were lost or looking for trouble. He opened the hatch to find a man in a windbreaker standing in the fading light. "Mr. Ward," the stranger asked. "County Environmental Inspector. Name's Crowley. Mind if I step in for a minute?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Crowley ducked through the doorway, eyes scanning the dim interior, pausing at the monitor on the table. Still keeping busy with that, he asked with an edge of dry humor. "Just habit," Ethan said. "Old miners don't stop checking the air even when the mine's gone." Crowley gave a tired smile. "Funny you say that. We've had complaints lately, people upwind saying they catch a smell. Sharp, like sulfur or gas." You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Ethan studied him, searching for the trick. I've been logging methane levels, he admitted. They spike when pressure drops. You've got a vent line open somewhere that's not supposed to be. Crowley's expression didn't change. He walked closer to the workbench, tracing a finger over the edge of the notebook. You should probably stop keeping those logs, he said quietly. Why's that? Crowley met his gaze. Because if there's gas leaking, the reclamation certification is invalid, the mine becomes an active hazard again. And that means someone in the county and at Black Basin Mining gets fired, maybe worse. Ethan felt the air tighten between them. So what you're saying is the system's broken. Crowley sighed, looking older than his badge. What I'm saying is no one's going to reopen that file, not after 12 years. They sealed it, called it safe, got their bonuses. If you find something now, you're just stirring ghosts. Ghost's low growl filled the silence deep and steady. Crowley took a step back. Palms raised. Easy. I'm just the messenger. He started toward the door, pausing on the ladder. Mr. Ward, I never said you were wrong. I'm telling you, there's pressure upstairs not to hear it. When he was gone, Ethan stood alone in the hum of the generator, the smell of dust and oil thick around him. He looked at Ghost, who still faced the door, ears twitching toward the ridge. Outside, the wind had turned north again. The monitor beeped once, a sharp tone echoing in the hollow space. The needle climbed. Ghost's head lifted nose toward the vent. Ethan followed his gaze, heart sinking as he saw the thin wisp of vapor rising against the dusk, curling toward the stars like breath from a buried lung. Ghost returned with a dead marten in his jaws, and the sight brought back the sharp tug of responsibility. He laid the animal on a clean sheet and noted the dust clinging to its fur, the kind only found near the mine. He wrapped the marten in a paper towel, not out of sentiment, but because habits entrenched in a lifetime around hazards die slow. You package, you preserve, you document. Then he filled sterile jars he'd gotten from the county extension office, dug with deliberate steady strokes at the fracture Ghost had found, scraping a sample of the pulverized soil into one jar and scooped pour water into another where moisture pooled darkly between broken rock and root. He labeled each container with the date-time GPS coordinates taken from the cheap handheld and the initials GW, the same shorthand he'd used in old safety logs. The handwriting felt oddly ceremonial. He placed the samples in his battered cooler with ice, then drove the gravel road into town boots, crunching gas monitor tucked inside his jacket like a talisman. At the University Extension Lab, the technician was polite but brisk, an underpaid woman with a farm science badge who accepted the cooler and handed Ethan a chain of custody form. When he explained he was a private citizen, concerned the old mine might be leaking something worse than methane. She nodded with the kind of professional empathy that knows too many small tragedies and not enough solutions. He left the samples and the form and the technician's promise, 48 to 72 hours for results, and walked back to his truck with the same hollow feeling that followed every inventory of unknowns. The rhythm of the wait was hard. He paced his bunker, rechecked the monitor logs, watched Ghost sleep in the slant of afternoon light, and tried to make the numbers align into a story that would stick in the right ears. When the call finally came, it was late and the lab was empty except for the soft hum of refrigeration. "Mr. Ward," a woman's voice asked over the line. He recognized her voice now, the patient cadence of someone who'd handled more agricultural mishaps than she cared to count. She said the word nitrate first, and it landed in his chest like a stone. Then sulfate. Then a sentence that made him straighten as if someone had slapped the air out of his lungs. There are indicators consistent with ANFO-type residues and traces of hydrocarbons consistent with diesel. He stared at the peeling paint on the wall as if it could explain the list of chemicals. He asked questions he'd rehearsed in the truck and on the ridge, how certain, what levels, any chance of contamination. She told him about blank controls and cross-checks about how the sample jars had been sealed and logged properly and how the lab had rerun tests on the powder and the pour water to be sure. She was careful with her words the way a coroner is careful to explain certainty in the lab translates to responsibility in the field. ANFO ammonium nitrate fuel oil is not the ghost of methane. It is deliberate energy, a program, if you will, an industrial explosive used in mining and construction when one needs a controlled, powerful blast. It is not something that spontaneously forms in the ground. Ethan felt the rational part of his brain step forward and catalog what that meant. Someone had introduced explosive material here at some point. He asked about timing, and she said she could estimate relative age from nitrate to sulfate ratios and from the state of the particulates found on the animal's fur and in the sediment. The numbers suggested the chemical fingerprint was not ancient. They suggested activity after the official closure timeline, not before. He moved to sit, and his knees protested like old machinery. His mind swung back to the fragment Ghost had brought to the serial number that hadn't matched BBM's suppliers, and to Crowley's warning about seals and paperwork. The idea of an after-the-fact, human-caused charge, someone bringing ANFO into a supposedly reclaimed site, unsettled him down to the marrow. It made the county's reluctance to reopen files look less like bureaucratic inertia and more like willful blindness tied to interests that did not want the ground opened again. He wrote each of the lab results into his notebook on a fresh line, date and time, and the technician's name, where signatures would someday matter. He printed a copy of the email the technician sent with digital attachments and placed it with the jar in a locked box. Then he drove to the place where the teenagers had been hanging out and photographed the flattened grass, the beer cans half buried in frost, and the faint ring where a bonfire might have been. He took a sample from the edge of that ring and bagged it, thinking like a man who had learned that evidence built a bridge between what someone sees in a single moment. Ghost with a dead animal, a boy throwing rocks, and what the law might be forced to recognize. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat with the gas monitor on the table and the cooler on the floor. Ghost's warm body curled across his feet, and thought about how the nitrate ratios could be read as a ledger of time, how levels in the pore water suggested the chemical environment had been disturbed after the mine was purportedly sealed. It contradicted the old accusation lodged against him, the story that had sent him away that the mine had simply built pressure and exploded. If someone had introduced boosters or fuel, it shifted culpability away from a single negligent technician and toward organized post-closure activity. He had no illusions that proving this would be easy. Labs can be dismissed, chains of custody can be questioned, and memories get murky. But he also knew that the chemistry was less forgiving than testimony if the particles were where the lab said they were. Someone had moved explosives into the ground after it was supposed to be safe. He ran a finger along the rim of the jar and felt the cold glass as if it were a pulse. Outside, the wind had changed direction and the ridge breathed in a way that made his teeth ache. He thought of Crowley's tired eyes and the comment about not wanting to reopen files. He thought of the young man whose father had died and the cruel, clean way the town had folded the tragedy into a narrative that made it tidy and done. The lab results did not change the town's whispers overnight, but they braided a new thread into the gossip, a possibility that the mine's story was not finished. Ethan sat up into the small hours turning over what to do next, aware that finding the point of entry, the place where ANFO or diesel had been taken underground, would be the key to turning chemical signatures into a map someone with authority would have to take seriously. And that map would have to be a more precise document than any he could draw by eye if the next steps were to lead him inside safely and with witnesses to see what had been hidden. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed down on the valley like unfinished work. Ethan drove into town with the lab report folded neatly inside his jacket, the paper still smelling faintly of printer ink and metal. He parked outside the Flathead County Records office, where the air always smelled like old paper and cleaning solvent, and walked past the public archives sign that had faded almost to nothing. He told the clerk he needed access to the microfiche archive for mining permits and accident records from 12 to 15 years ago, his voice low but steady, like a man who already knew the answer but needed proof. The woman behind the counter, thin and polite, gave him a badge without asking too many questions. Backroom Cabinet 4. you'll have to wind them yourself," she said, nodding toward a narrow hallway. The projector hummed to life with a sound like a soft wasp trapped in a jar. Rows of blue film glowed against the lens as Ethan scrolled through images, his fingers moving with mechanical precision. He knew exactly what to look for: the MSHA Form 7000. 1. The federal document every mine is required to file after an accident, and the engineering schematics submitted before the closure. Each film sheet was labeled by quarter year and operator. Black Basin Mining had at least 8 reels worth of paperwork. The hours blurred into the rhythm of the machine click-flick focus record. He made notes on scrap paper comparing engineering stamps, inspection initials, and submission dates. Most of it was routine ventilation shafts, labeled safety seals drawn in neat lines, but one notation made him pause. On a blueprint labeled BBM Main East Layout Revision 6 As-Built Confirmation. A faint erasure caught his eye. Near the bottom of the map, an access route labeled E3 Bypass had been smudged out with a grease pencil, the edges still visible when he adjusted the contrast knob. He rewound and checked the as-designed version from the earlier reel. There, the E3 Bypass was clear-marked as explosives, storage, and maintenance. His pulse quickened. The bypass had existed in the design, and even in the early as-built inspection records, but was gone from the final submission filed after the explosion. He copied both frames onto a digital drive and printed low-resolution images. The omission wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately removed the bypass from the record after the fact. If that corridor had been real, it might have served as the entry point for whoever brought the ANFO underground after the mine's official shutdown. Ethan leaned back in the chair, the hum of the projector filling his ears, and felt the first real surge of vindication mix with dread. To confirm what he suspected, he'd need physical proof that the corridor still existed underground. He thanked the clerk, signed out, and drove to the hardware store where he rented a fiber optic inspection camera, the kind used by plumbers to look behind walls. Back at the ridge, the wind had picked up again, carrying a low whistle through the grass. Ghost trotted ahead, nose low, tail straight. Ethan found the same fracture where the smoke had been drawn downward and began setting up the small rig. He drilled into the soil just enough to widen the crack without disturbing the fragile crust, then fed the camera's slender cable into the darkness. The live feed flickered onto his tablet, gray and grainy, showing a narrow void lined with decayed wood. He adjusted the focus. The lens caught something strange: timber supports, cribbing cut in clean square ends, not the splintered, aged remains of 20-year-old bracing. He recognized the marks instantly. They were saw cuts, straight and sharp, the pattern of a modern chainsaw. He zoomed closer. On one beam, the cut surface was pale, still rough to the touch, not yet darkened by time or moisture. 10, maybe 11 years old at most. That would put it several years after the mine's closure, long after his conviction. "Someone's been down here," he whispered. Ghost's ears twitched, head tilted toward the sound of Ethan's voice. The camera shifted again, revealing a narrow void sloping deeper with the debris piled along one wall, scrap metal fragments of plastic sheeting, and what looked like a spool of wire. The timestamp on the feed blinked steadily, proof that it wasn't imagination. Ethan withdrew the cable, wound it carefully, and saved the video to the drive. His hands were steady, but his breathing wasn't. Whoever had entered that bypass had done it with purpose, someone with equipment, someone who knew how to hide the signs but not well enough. He carried the gear inside, cleaned the drill bit, and laid the printouts from the archive beside his logbook. 2 versions of the same map, one with E3 marked 1 without, lay side by side under the lamplight. The difference was a gap of less than an inch on paper, but years of truth in the world. Ghost settled near the door, watching as Ethan sketched a rough overlay marking the likely connection point between the fracture and where the bypass should emerge deeper in the ridge. The measurements lined up disturbingly close. He thought of Crowley's words of reclamation bonuses and of the quiet pressure that made men erase lines to protect their paychecks. The bypass was real, and the cribbing below confirmed recent human access. But going in blind would mean breaking safety laws, and after 6 years behind bars for something he didn't do, Ethan wasn't about to trespass into another legal trap. He'd need a sanctioned entry someone with credentials who could witness what he found and file the paperwork properly. For that, he'd have to call someone he hadn't spoken to in years, someone who'd stopped taking his calls after the trial, but whose union card and name still carried weight in the county safety office. He stared at the phone on his desk, the receiver covered in dust, and exhaled through his teeth. Ghost's tail brushed his boot a silent nudge towards decision. Ethan lifted the receiver and dialed slowly, listening to each tone echo in the bunker's hollow air as the wind outside began to pick up again, carrying with it the faint rhythmic breath of the mine beneath the ridge. The man arrived in a black SUV that looked too new for the gravel road and too clean for a town that still had oil stains on its main street. He stepped out with a leather folder and a smile practiced enough to be almost polite, and when he offered his card, Ethan read the name twice. Randall Pierce, Corporate Affairs Commonwealth Underwriters, and felt the skin at the back of his neck go cool in a way the cold wind never managed. Ethan recognized Commonwealth from old trial transcripts. They were the carrier that had written the big check after the explosion 12 years ago, the company whose adjusters had rewritten narratives to close claims fast. The man introduced himself again, voice even and casual, and explained that his firm was interested in purchasing the reclaimed lot where Ethan's underground house sat. "We're building a small solar installation," Randall said, the exact phrase used by a dozen land speculators across a dozen counties, as if renewable projects were a polite mask for anything else one might want under a wide sky. "It's turnkey money," he added, sliding a glossy sheet of numbers across Ethan's table that showed a figure nearly 20 times the assessed value on the county tax roll. Ethan looked at the columns the way he looked at mine plans, seeing not just numbers, but pressure points. Ghost slept at his feet and raised an ear, watching the visitor, not trusting the crispness of the suit. "Why me?" Ethan asked. "Why buy this particular parcel?" Randall's eyes flicked imperceptibly to the map pinned behind Ethan's lamp, to the faint pencil mark where the crack in the slope had been. "Opportunity," he said. "Stability, long-term leases, community goodwill. We're investing in low-profile solar to help towns transition." He made it sound like a sermon. Ethan felt the old reflex take any offer that makes life easier and push it away because it had been trained out of him by a judge's gavel and a cell block. He didn't need money, he needed answers. Still, the offer demanded attention. After Randall left, Ethan drove the deed to the county recorder's office like a man carrying a fragile relic. He asked for chain of title and any LLC filings related to recent purchases near Black Basin. The clerk pulled up records and printed them in a slow mechanical stack. Back at the bunker, he compared the deed to the glossy paper Randall had left, then cross-checked the LLC name that showed up on the deed, Sable Ridge Renewables LLC, against state filings, and found a series of shell companies that funneled into a parent entity, Commonwealth Conservation Partners. A cold, rational piece of his mind clicked into place if the carrier's investment arm bought the parcel, and if the land stayed labeled reclaimed, then the historical finding that the mine was closed and safe would remain undisturbed on paper. If, however, the parcel were to be reclassified as active hazard, a technical designation used by MSHA and insurers alike, it would trigger subrogation, the legal mechanism allowing insurers to sue third parties who caused losses. In plain terms, opening the case again could flip liability back onto a company that had paid out 12 years ago, and avoidable expense could become catastrophic on the balance sheet. He folded the papers, the edges sharp under his thumb. Later that afternoon, when the SUV returned to the edge of the ridge and a man in a cheap polo walked the property line as if staking his claim, Ghost slipped out from behind the hatch and moved like a shadow to the vehicle. As Randall turned to leave, Ghost brushed past his leg and knocked a leather folder from his hand. A slim digital voice recorder slid across the gravel. Ethan picked it up, its screen still on the last file. He pressed play. The speaker crackled to life. "If that lot gets relisted as an active hazard, subrogation triggers Marcus. We can't have that. Pull anything suggesting contamination. Get Crowley to close those complaints. Pay a few hands if you must. Just Don't let it relist. Ethan saved the file to his phone and photographed the recorder's serial number before handing it back. The name Marcus, the clipped tone, and the way the voice used the insurance term as if it were a budget line made Ethan's jaw go still. He replayed the clip twice, then stored the file on his phone and felt the world narrow to a single hard line. This was not a random buyout. It was a containment strategy, a tidy corporate move to keep legal exposure off a ledger. Ghost set the keys at Ethan's feet and looked up, eyes steady and clear, as if to say, "I brought you the answer you were asking the wind to give you." The idea that money was the motive, rather than simple interest in solar, pulled together the lab results. The erased bypass on the as-built maps and Crowley's thin warning into a coherent picture. Someone with resources and a vested interest in silence had the means and motive to orchestrate a cover. Ethan's chest tightened with a familiar pressure anger tempered by the realistic understanding that this was now beyond what one man could fix with a notebook and a camera. He needed certified witnesses, legal cover, and proper confined space protocols if he was going to take another step into that bypass. He needed people whose names would carry weight in MSHA reports and court filings, and he needed them to go down with him in a way that the law would recognize as legitimate and safe, not as a guerrilla excavation led by an ex-convict with a dog. He closed his hand around the keys and looked toward the ridge where the crack breathed faintly under the afternoon light, and the thought of picking up the phone to call a union name he hadn't spoken to since the trial felt like the first deliberate action he'd taken in years, an action that would change everything if it worked, and expose him to danger if it didn't. Ethan drove to the Union Hall with the lab printouts folded in his pocket and an old sense of protocol like a second skin. He had called one number and left the rest to fate. But when Marty Delgado, the erstwhile shift foreman who had once run 3 faces of the pit and still wore his union ring like an anchor, answered the door, he did not flinch at Ethan's name or his history. Marty's face registered nothing but the flat practical concern of a man who had seen men die for reasons that were never tidy. Ethan briefed him in the quiet of the back room, sliding pages of map overlays and lab results across the table, while Ghost sat patient by his boot harness, clipped, and a small LED lantern strapped to his chest so he'd be visible in the dark. Marty didn't roll his eyes at the part where Ethan explained Crowley's warning or the Bluetooth recording. Instead, he set his jaw and said, "We do this right, or we don't do it at all." He called 2 SR volunteers he trusted, Jess, a paramedic and rope rescue instructor, and Hank, a retired mine rescue tech with creased hands and a grin that always made men relax, and they came armed with certification cards and sensible boots. Under the county's incident command system, the site was classified as an active hazard. Marty logged a formal confined space entry plan. The county issued an emergency entry authorization tied to a new incident number, and MSHA received a same-day notification with a return receipt. Only after those clearances posted did the team proceed. Ethan signed each form with a hand that did not shake. The signatures felt like a reclamation of process, a claim that what he was about to do would be witnessed, catalogued, and defensible. They set up at the crack where the smoke had once been drawn away. The team set ventilation gas monitoring and communication lines no step missed. Ghost watched everything with an intensity that made Marty comment half to himself, "That dog's more disciplined than half the rookies I buried." Ethan's chest tightened with a mixture of gratitude and old pain. Ghost had been his anchor through every long night he'd kept to himself. They fed the fiber-optic camera back down the narrow slot to confirm the path-verified stable readings at the face with 2 calibrated multi-gas meters, and only then lowered. Jess first clipped to a line moving slow as smoke through the aperture. The tunnel gave up blurred walls and splinters on the tablet, and then the team saw timber framed in unexpected places, a patch where cribbing had been reworked, where the grain of the wood still showed fairly sharp saw marks. Jess called back, voice steady, and Marty followed 2 minutes later on a longer tether. The bypass sloped and tightened and then opened into a low gallery, where the ground suddenly smelled faint of oil, a smell that made Ethan's mouth go dry in a way that had nothing to do with the dust. They moved with measured steps and light beams. Ghost padded behind them, nose-low chest lamp painting the walls in a raw amber cone. The camera caught something that made everyone freeze: coils of detonation cord, and a cluster of NFO initiator connectors, plastic splices, and color-coded caps that bore the print of Rapid Rock's standardized fittings, a supplier Ethan had read about in contractor logs for pipeline jobs but which had never been hired by Black Basin Mining. The sight translated across the radio as white noise for a moment, then Jess breathed, "That's not BBM gear." Hank crouched and removed one of the caps with gloved hands, photographing the imprint. The discovery was more than corroboration of the lab. It was a fingerprint pointing to an external operator with equipment and knowledge, and it undermined a narrative that had once painted Ethan as the sole agent of catastrophe. As they pushed deeper, Hank's lamp swept across what looked like a flattened section of conduit, and there, half-submerged in silt, lay a data logger MSA, a compact unit used to record gas concentrations over time. It was dirty and scarred. Its battery long, dead. Jess powered it from a bench supply topside, and the logger booted. Jess retrieved it carefully and brought it to the surface for download. The timestamp on the logger was intact. When they pulled the file and scrolled the recorded stream 2 hours backward from the recorded blast time on the old court docket, the team fell quiet. As the graph unfolded, methane levels hovered safely in the low single digits. Oxygen remained in the safe band. Sudden spikes appeared only in the minutes corresponding to the actual event. In other words, 2 hours prior, the environment had been stable, unsupportive of spontaneous methane-driven detonation, and then someone had introduced an external energy source. Marty's face went hard and then soft with something like anger braided with relief. "It proves what you said," he muttered. Ethan felt the air in the tunnel tighten and his throat close with an emotion that was not triumph, but a raw liquid mix of vindication and sorrow for the men whose names he still heard at night. They documented everything with photographs, notes, and a chain of custody log initiated by Jess and countersigned by Marty. Each photograph and each log entry felt like a small barricade against erasure, a way to make the bypass and its contents speak in terms that courts and agencies could not ignore. They worked until the lights ached and the blower hummed like a distant engine, and every step of the way Ghost stayed close, uncomplaining ears flicking at every shift of sound. The logger file, downloaded to a secure laptop and duplicated to 2 drives, bore the numbers that would later be read in sterile conference rooms and official hearings, methane safe, 2 hours before the blast. A clean, sudden input thereafter. It was a data set that argued the explosion's cause was not negligence born of negligence of gas readings, but of human decision and intervention, a technical rebuke to the prosecution's old case against Ethan. Yet, as they packed up their gear, Marty's fingers lingered on a rusty bracket, and his voice dropped to a grave whisper. "This ground still moves on you. Watch the ceiling when you go next time." The ventilation had bought them safety, for now the documentation had built them credibility, and Ghost's calm presence had steadied nerves. But the tunnel's ancient will to shift and the unstable cribbing indicated a risk that could not be ignored. The morning began like any other shift, quiet, deliberate air monitors humming in the low register of safety. Ethan and Marty had returned underground to collect hardware samples, roof plates, rock bolts, and anchor washers from the section near the bypass junction where cribbing had shown tool marks. Jess remained topside, logging airflow and maintaining line-of-sight communication through the cable feed. Ghost followed close, the small light on his harness cutting a clean path through dust motes that shimmered in the beam. They moved carefully, the air thick with moisture and a scent like cold iron. Ethan loosened the first bolt with a ratchet, the sound sharp in the chamber, and bagged it for lab analysis. When he reached for the next one, a faint creak trembled through the roof, soft, uncertain, like a whisper of warning. Marty turned light, sweeping upward, and for half a heartbeat everything was still. Then the timber above them snapped like brittle bone. The ceiling groaned, earth shifting in slow motion, and a spray of dust filled the tunnel. Marty dove clear, shouting Ethan's name. Ethan twisted instinctively, trying to leap toward the ladder rung, but a heavy slab struck his right leg, pinning it just above the ankle. The pain came not as a scream, but a hard flash of heat that made the edges of the world blur. The comm line crackled. Jess's voice cut through calling for a response. "Cave-in partial." Marty coughed. "We're stable, but Ethan's pinned." Ghost barked once, a sharp command from training days long past. Ethan gritted his teeth, sucked in a slow breath, and forced his voice steady. "Get out. Roof's unstable." Marty hesitated, but Ethan jerked his chin toward Ghost. "He can fit through the vent. Go." The shepherd understood before words finished forming. He turned light, bouncing off his chest plate, and disappeared down the narrow vent shaft, claws clicking against the rock. Dust swirled behind him like smoke. Marty anchored a jack prop, secured the rope to Ethan's harness, and shouted into the comm surface, "Prepare for extraction, one trapped partial collapse at 30 meters in." Jess's reply came fragmented static, cutting every third word. Then the channel went dead. Pinned, Ethan kept his breathing steady. He tightened the tourniquet above his boot, listened for the sound of Ghost, and waited. In town, just as the first light hit the frozen asphalt, Deputy Carl Reeves pushed open the door of the corner store, nodding to the clerk on his way to the coffee urn. He was not thinking of Ethan Ward. He hadn't for years, except in those brief moments when guilt visited uninvited, reminding him that he had stood in court and testified about faulty readings and ignored warnings testimony that had helped put a man behind bars. He was stirring sugar into his cup when the door banged open and a German shepherd barreled inside, panting, hard harness light still blinking red. The dog's chest heaved, emitting a strange keening sound halfway between a bark and a howl. Reeves froze, recognizing the animal from the ridge, the one everyone called Ghost. "Hey!" the clerk shouted, but Ghost darted forward, teeth gripping the dangling lifeline rope that trailed mud and dust. He tugged sharply, then released, then tugged again, eyes locked on Reeves, as if willing him to understand. It wasn't random. It was communication. Reeves stepped forward, kneeling his instincts as an old rescue volunteer kicking through the years of desk work. The rope was taut, clipped to a carabiner that bore fresh scratches and dust fine as flour. He followed Ghost outside, and the dog bolted toward the highway, pausing every few yards to make sure he was being followed. Reeves hesitated only once before keying his radio. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Reeves. Possible mine collapse at Ward property. Notify County Search and Rescue. Request State Mine Rescue on standby." By the time they reached the ridge, the first rescue vehicles were already rolling in sirens, silent, but lights cutting through the pale air. Ghost led the crew straight to the ventilation shaft, pawing at the edge, whining low. Jess ran up, covered in dirt, shouting coordinates. Reeves took command without ceremony, his voice calm but sharp, as he relayed updates to the state team. Within minutes, the Montana Mine Rescue Unit arrived with pneumatic supports, listening gear, and medics. As they began digging through the choke of debris, Ghost stood just behind the perimeter tape, trembling with a contained urgency that infected the crew with focus. When they broke through, the first thing the rescuers saw was the beam of a helmet light cutting upward through the dust. Marty was alive, coughing one arm around Ethan's shoulder. They hauled both men out in a practiced ballet of efficiency. The medics checked Ethan's leg, stabilized it, and began treating for crush injury. Ghost pressed his head against Ethan's handtail, low but wagging eyes bright with a kind of quiet triumph. Reeves stepped forward, pulling off his gloves, and for a long moment their eyes met, one man who had testified against the other, now kneeling to help secure the splint that might save his leg. No words passed between them, only the shared weight of understanding that time had made heavier, not lighter. As the rescue team cleared the debris, Jess motioned to one of the engineers. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a roof plate half buried under the rubble. It gleamed oddly beneath the dust, the paint not rusted but glossy fresh by comparison. She brushed away the dirt to reveal a red diagonal stripe, a color code for post-closure reinforcement used by private contractors during structural audits. "That paint's not 12 years old," Marty said quietly. Reeves overheard his expression changing. The foreman nodded toward Ethan, who was being loaded into the ambulance, and said, "He was right. Someone's been in there since." The find was cataloged immediately, photographs taken, witnesses logged. Reeves signed the report himself, noting color marking inconsistent with original BBM material inventory. His signature meant that the evidence now belonged to public record, not rumor. The mine that had once taken 7 men and 1 man's reputation had now taken a turn in daylight, with a dog's insistence pulling a whole town back towards truth. As the ambulance doors closed, Ghost jumped lightly inside, settling beside Ethan's stretcher. The siren remained off, only the steady pulse of the heart monitor filling the silence as they descended toward town. Outside, the crew continued their careful excavation, unaware that each bolt and beam they uncovered would later become the backbone of a case file, proof that silence had been bought and truth buried under layers of paint and policy, waiting only for a dog's bark and a man's stubbornness to unearth it again. The hospital smell of antiseptic and linen hung in the air, but Ethan's focus was elsewhere, on the stack of evidence bags sitting neatly at the foot of his bed. The gas data logger, the detonator cord, fragments the roof plate with its unmistakable red marking, and the sample vials now sealed and labeled. Ghost lay curled near his chair, eyes half closed but ears still alert to every footstep in the hallway. When Marty entered, his jacket still coated with dust, he nodded toward the evidence. MSHA's sending a courier. Chain of custody's in motion. You ready to sign? Ethan adjusted himself upright and reached for the clipboard Marty handed him. Each signature brought the truth further into daylight. He checked every serial number twice, making sure it matched the digital log Jess had kept during the rescue. The MSHA district office had agreed to receive the materials that same day, after a call from the state attorney's office describing the collapse and the discovery of items inconsistent with BBM's closure report. When the agents arrived wearing khaki uniforms and carrying a portable evidence cooler, Ethan insisted on explaining each sample personally. These wires, he said, tapping the labeled bag, are Rapid Rock brand used for controlled blasting and pipeline work. They weren't part of BBM's supply chain. One of the inspectors, a serious woman named Agent Hall, nodded, recording every detail in her log. She handed Ethan the official Form 2000, 5 evidence custody record, and walked him through each signature space. It was the first time in 12 years that his name appeared in an MSHA report without the word defendant attached to it. Marty stood beside him through the process, his presence both quiet and protective. When the evidence cooler was sealed and the agents left, he exhaled slowly. You did it right this time, he said. Chain's clean. Nobody can bury this. Ethan looked at the dog, sleeping at his feet. We'll see, he murmured. The following week, his volunteer lawyer, a former JAG officer named Carter Hayes, filed parallel requests, a Freedom of Information Act request, and an expedited state public records request tied to the active investigation. Hayes's tone was professional but firm. They'll delay, they'll redact, but the paper trail's there somewhere, he told Ethan. Once it's public record, they can't take it back. 3 weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, depositions, and restless nights punctuated by Ghost's gentle weight against his side. Then the first twist came not from a courtroom but from a lab bench. The MSHA Analytical Division emailed its official findings to the district office, and Agent Hall personally called Ethan to summarize before releasing the report. Mr. Ward, she said, our lab tested the booster residues you submitted. They do not match any batch logged under Black Basin Mining's explosive procurement records. The formulation matches a type produced for Rapid Rock industrial contractors, specifically their PX series, which was used on pipeline work in the Northern Corridor around 2011. BBM's last order was in 2008, and from a different manufacturer. Her tone softened slightly. This means the material in your sample couldn't have been from the mine's official inventory. Ethan closed his eyes, the information sinking in like a tide pulling away years of mud. It wasn't speculation anymore. The data logger had proven methane was stable before detonation. Now the chemical signature proved the explosion's source came from outside BBM's control. Thank you, he said quietly, gripping the edge of the table. Hall hesitated before adding, Our office is recommending a federal review. There's more here than procedural error. 3 weeks later, Hayes called again. This time his voice carried both satisfaction and disbelief. "You're not going to like how simple it is," he began. The expedited state records response had come back and buried among hundreds of pages of correspondence between BBM, the insurer, and subcontractors was an internal email thread dated 3 weeks after mine closure. The subject line read Salvage Coordination Access via East Vent. The sender was an operations manager from Rapid Rock, the same company identified by the lab report. In the message, the manager stated that his crew had entered the Black Basin site to reclaim copper wiring and steel mesh left in the lower drifts. The line that followed froze Hayes mid-sentence as he read it aloud to Ethan. Minimal charges used to clear blockages at E3 bypass, ground stable. Attached notes included insurance correspondence, instructing that the incident not be classified as site re-entry to prevent reopening of liability coverage. One reply from a Commonwealth executive contained the chilling summary: "Acknowledge. Do not circulate. Any injuries or gas ignition events tied to this period would jeopardize final indemnity." The room was silent except for the hum of the oxygen pump from Ethan's leg therapy device. Hayes exhaled. There it is. Not sabotage, not conspiracy to kill, just greed and negligence they couldn't afford to admit. The truth was as infuriating as it was mundane unauthorized scavengers hired quietly by a contractor who wanted the scrap value of copper and steel had entered a sealed mine without permits, used leftover explosive boosters to open a collapsed drift, and triggered the sequence that killed 7 men and destroyed Ethan's career. The insurance carrier, facing massive payouts, had chosen to suppress evidence of post-closure trespass to avoid reopening its own financial exposure. BBM had complied to preserve its reclamation status. The simplest chain of motives, money, convenience, reputation, had twisted into a system that blamed the one man least equipped to defend himself. Ethan listened, the corners of his mouth tightening as if to hold back both anger and relief. Ghost lifted his head, sensing the shift in him pressing close to his side. The lawyer's voice softened. "We'll build this right. The email, the lab report, the logger. They're enough to petition for exoneration." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the evidence chain receipt still taped to the wall. What had begun as a man's private search for closure had become a formal record with witnesses' signatures and dates, something that could stand on its own without emotion because truth written in ink was harder to erase than rumor whispered in bars. Outside, snow began to fall softly across the ridge covering the scars of excavation, while the world above shifted quietly toward reckoning. The courthouse in Flathead County looked the same as it had 12 years earlier. Gray sandstone walls, an American flag stiff in the wind, and the same squeak in the front door hinge that Ethan had memorized from the day he walked through it in handcuffs. This time, he came through on crutches, Ghost padding quietly beside him in a service vest, and Marty at his shoulder. The benches were filled not with journalists, but with miners' rescue workers and townspeople who had once whispered his name with suspicion. The air carried the soft rustle of paper and the distant click of camera shutters, but there was no spectacle, only the low murmur of waiting. Across the aisle sat the assistant district attorney, a woman young enough to have been in grade school during the original case. She rose when the judge entered and began to speak, her tone measured but unwavering. "Your Honor, the state, after consultation with the Office of Mine Safety and Health Administration and the Attorney General's Special Review Board, respectfully petitions this court to vacate the conviction of Ethan Ward in Case 09-CR-144 on the grounds of newly discovered evidence and faulty expert narrative presented at the time of trial." The words "vacate the conviction" seemed to hang in the air longer than any others, heavy with the years they carried. Ethan kept his gaze steady, one hand resting lightly on Ghost's head. The prosecutor continued summarizing the findings: the chemical evidence identifying Rapid Rock explosives, the MSHA gas data proving methane stability, the FOIA-released emails showing unauthorized entry after closure, and the recently uncovered chain of command between BBM and Commonwealth underwriters. The evidence demonstrates, she said, that the explosion on June 19, 2010, was not the result of negligence by any BBM employee present that day, but of unpermitted blasting operations conducted after closure. Mr. Ward was wrongfully convicted due to incomplete and misleading forensic testimony. She paused, then added quietly, "The state expresses regret for the miscarriage of justice." When she sat down, the courtroom stayed silent until Judge Layton leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "Before I rule," she said, "I understand there are families here who wish to be heard." In the second row, a man stood, a young adult now, but Ethan recognized him instantly, the same eyes as the boy who had once thrown a rock at his door. His name was Tyler Granger, son of one of the miners lost in the blast. Tyler approached the front holding a small scuffed phone in his hand. His voice was rough but steady. "I thought I hated you," he said, not looking directly at Ethan yet. "I believed what they said. But a few weeks ago, when they called families for the review, I went through my dad's old things. I found his flip phone, the one he always carried underground. It still had a picture from that morning." He handed the phone to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The grainy image projected onto the courtroom screen showed the junction room at the mine's surface, the main switchboard, the metal tag that marked the lockout on the electrical isolator, a safety requirement that prevented accidental power-ups during maintenance. The tag was missing the shackle open, but most telling was the sign-off signature scrawled across the bottom of the log sheet taped beside it. "That's not yours, is it?" the judge asked, turning to Ethan. He shook his head once. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "Mine were block letters, that's cursive." Tyler's voice broke slightly, "I know. My dad took that photo because he said somebody had been messing with the lockout the day before. He didn't think it mattered. But it was dated the night before the blast." The courtroom exhaled as one, the silence following louder than any gasp. The judge reviewed the image, compared it to exhibits from the trial, and wrote a short note on the pad before her. Then she said the words Ethan had stopped believing he would ever hear. "The conviction is vacated. Mr. Ward, the record shall reflect you are fully exonerated of all charges." For a moment, Ethan didn't move. Marty's hand clapped his shoulder, and Ghost, sensing the shift, pressed against his leg-tail, tapping once against the floor. The sound of it, simple steady, seemed to fill the room. Later, outside, under a pale Montana sky, reporters gathered but kept a respectful distance. Ethan's lawyer addressed the press, first confirming that BBM and Commonwealth had reached a civil resolution with the victims' families, a miners' memorial trust fund, and a respiratory clinic to provide long-term care for anyone affected by the mine's past air exposure. When the microphone turned to Ethan, he said only, "I didn't come back for money. I came back for the truth. And now that we have it, what matters is making sure no one else ever gets buried twice the first time, by stone, the second by silence." He declined the personal settlement that would have covered a lifetime's comfort, accepting only reimbursement for court fees and the restoration of his pension. His request was simple, that the memorial and clinic carry the names of the men who never came home. Tyler approached him quietly after the crowd dispersed. "I don't know if you can forgive me," he said. Ethan studied the young man's face, the awkward sincerity in his voice, and then shook his head slowly. "There's nothing to forgive. You lost your dad. You believed what they told you. We both did." Tyler nodded, tears bright in the corners of his eyes. He knelt to scratch Ghost's neck, smiling faintly. "Guess he knew before any of us," he said. He never stopped coming back to that ridge. Ethan looked down at the dog who stood between them, tail moving gently, amber eyes reflecting both men. "He listens to things people forget how to hear," Ethan said softly. Tyler laughed once through his tears, and it broke something open in both of them, a kind of release that didn't erase the past, but let it breathe again. That evening, as the sun set behind the ridge, Ethan sat outside his modest home, no longer a bunker but a proper dwelling carved into the hillside with open skylights. Ghost rested his chin on Ethan's knee. The distant hum of construction from the memorial site reached them through the wind. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't flinch at the sound. Vindication, he realized, wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and honest. And though the law had cleared his name, what mattered more was that the town had begun to speak it again without shame, preparing to build something lasting on the ground that had once buried the truth. Winter gave way to a slow Montana spring, the kind that turned frost into streams running down from the hills. The Black Basin site no longer looked like the wound it once was. Where tailings had scattered new soil had been laid, and a chain-link fence marked the perimeter of the sealed drift. MSHA crews had come in one last time, filling the access shafts with concrete plugs and epoxy foam, their heavy machinery echoing briefly before the valley fell quiet again. When the last cap set, Ethan signed the closure document as a witness, his name written beside the inspector's this time not as a suspect, but as a guardian of what remained. The concrete lids were smooth gray against the red earth, and each one bore a small steel plate etched with the words, "Do not disturb." Memorial Subsurface Zone. Ghost walked beside him, as always, his paws silent on the gravel, pausing to sniff the air every few feet as though cataloging the land one final time. The day of the dedication came bright but cold. Families gathered at the base of the ridge where the new Grant Granger Memorial would stand, a bronze plaque set into a low stone wall listing 7 names, the coordinates of the collapse, and a single line beneath. They gave their breath so others might learn to breathe safer. A local pastor spoke softly about redemption and endurance, and the wind seemed to quiet itself long enough for his words to linger. Ethan stood slightly apart, hands folded loosely in front of him, Ghost pressed to his side. When the pastor finished, the crowd moved toward the monument to place flowers and helmets. Ethan bent to set a small flag beside his former crew's names, fingers tracing each letter. That was when Ghost stopped moving. The dog froze a few feet away from the wall, nose to the ground, tail stiff. He whined, low-pawing at the dirt beside a half-buried boulder near the boundary marker. Ethan frowned, calling softly, but Ghost ignored him and began digging claws, throwing small clumps of damp soil aside. The sound drew attention. Marty, standing nearby, knelt to help brush the surface clear. Recent regrading for the memorial and 2 nights of heavy rain had scoured the thin topsoil. Within moments, the tip of something yellowed with age appeared, a curved piece of safety yellow plastic coated in clay. They dug gently, and when it came free, the color beneath showed faint but unmistakable safety yellow, with a cracked sticker bearing the faded logo of Black Basin Mining. A helmet. The last one unaccounted for. Inside the brim, barely visible, the letters L. Torres were scratched into the liner, the 7th man, the only name never recovered from the collapse. A hush fell over the gathering as Ethan held the helmet in both hands, turning it slowly in the light. Time and stone had tried to keep it hidden, but Ghost's nose had found what reports and maps could not. "Guess he wanted everyone home," Marty said quietly. Ethan nodded, voice low. He always did. The helmet was placed in a glass case beside the plaque, completing the circle that had remained open for more than a decade. As the crowd dispersed, the sun dipped behind the ridge, washing the valley in amber light. Ethan stayed until the last vehicle left, then walked back toward the slope where his underground home sat half hidden in the earth. He had kept it, though the courts in the town had offered to buy it for heritage preservation. He said no. Instead, he had rebuilt it from the inside out. The entry hatch now bore a polished brass sign that read Ward Training Facility for Confined Space Safety. Every month, local firefighters, miners, and rescue teams came for simulation drills, learning to handle air monitors, gas detectors, and rescue procedures in tight tunnels. Ethan taught them how to read pressure changes, how to mark their way with reflective tape, how to listen to the silence underground. Ghost, fitted with a small harness and light, worked alongside them, demonstrating search patterns for victims or trapped workers. The trainees called him Sergeant Ghost. He responded to every command patient and exact, as if he understood this was his purpose now, to keep others from being buried the way his master once was. On the first day of training, Ethan told the same quiet story of a man blamed because it was easier than admitting fault. He ended it the same way every time: nature hides what it must to heal. But if you learn to listen, the ground always speaks. You just have to be the kind of person who hears. His voice carried not anger, but calm conviction, the tone of someone who had learned that justice was not about vengeance, but clarity. That night, after the last class had left and the tunnel lights dimmed, Ethan stepped outside. The stars were clean and sharp against the mountain air. Ghost settled beside him, head resting on his boot eyes fixed on the quiet ridge. The wind carried the faint scent of wet stone and pine. "We're still underground, you and me," Ethan said softly. "But it feels different now." He looked at the plaque by the entrance bronze against the earth letters, catching the last trace of moonlight. They laughed because I lived underground. They forgot who was buried there first. He reached down, scratching behind Ghost's ear. The shepherd's tail thumped once, slow and certain like a heartbeat answering the earth's. The mine was sealed, the names remembered, and the house beneath the hill, once a place of exile, had become a sanctuary where others would learn how to survive the dark. Nature had tried to hide the truth under layers of rock and time, but a man and his dog had uncovered it with patience, loyalty, and the simple belief that silence was not the same as peace. As the night settled over the valley, the light from the underground training hall glowed faintly through the vents. A soft pulse under the soil, steady and alive proof that life could still thrive below the surface, and that sometimes the deepest wounds grew the strongest roots. Which part of Ethan and Ghost's story moved you most? Tell me in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. If you'd like more stories of courage and quiet redemption, make sure to like and subscribe for the next one.